recording is
Oh,
currently
you know what?
pending.
I'll start the recording, and if you want to also request control, we'll make sure that you are our backup plan. Okay, so you should also have control there. Perfect. Okay, so everyone, thank you so very much for taking the time to join us today. I'm Susan Van Meter. I'm the Executive Director of AdvaMedDx. Joined with my colleagues, Jamie Wolson, Assistant Vice President in our Technology and Regulatory Affairs Division, and our Chief Regulatory Experts on diagnostics issues. Our outside counsel, Nate Brown, who is a partner at Aitken Gump. We're really happy to be with you today. So the focus of today's presentation, and pardon me, I should remind you all, we are recording today's session. We'll make a link to the recording available after the session. We'll also make available a copy of the slide deck. These will be transmitted to you in an email from me. I'll also provide a link to additional resources, a two-pager we use with stakeholders on the Hill and in the patient community to describe in general what is diagnostics regulatory reform. Among other resources, you'll see links to these resources in the last slide of this slide deck today as well. We'll get started with the presentation, and I would just ask that we save questions till the end. We look forward to your questions, and we'll go through the presentation and have plenty of time, I'm sure, during this 90-minute session to get to your questions at the end. So thank you for that. So the purpose of today's session is to provide to you an overview of the VALID framework that is in the VALID Act of 2021 that was recently introduced. We'll start by talking a little bit about AdvaMedDx's historical position on diagnostics regulatory reform. We'll talk about the context around this new bill and its reintroduction. And then importantly, we'll provide an overview of the substance of VALID. So we'll walk you through what are the key definitions in VALID? How should you think about the framework for VALID? In other words, what are those pathways about which you can avail yourselves to take your technology through the agency? We'll hit on some key concepts, things like grandfathering, for example, very important. And then we'll give you our top line preliminary assessment of our top priorities in that bill. We've had the chance to meet with regulatory experts on a couple of occasions since reintroduction. We've had the benefit of their wisdom. That assessment process is going to continue. So again, a preliminary assessment, and then we'll round out the presentation portion of the discussion with our thoughts about next steps, chiefly on the Hill, and then certainly again, we'll have plenty of time for your questions. So first to start with, for those of you who have been members of AdvaMedDx for some time, you know it's been many years that the diagnostics industry has pursued comprehensive diagnostics regulatory reform. And we are closer to achieving reform than we have been in the past, most certainly. And crucial to reform for AdvaMedDx is that we would have a legislative apparatus for an overarching framework that would be diagnostic specific, and that would be very clearly risk-based. This framework should support innovation and do so in a way that is predictable so that you all understand what are the pathways about which you can avail yourself, how does your technology fit in, and it creates certain efficiencies that allow you to bring your tests more readily to market and iterate on those tests once they are on market. And this overarching framework, of course, would apply to both LDTs and IVDs. So a long-standing overarching position statement on where we have been on diagnostics regulatory reform and where we expect we will continue to be moving forward. So a bit about the context around the reintroduction of VALID. As many of you recall, VALID was first introduced in March of 2020, so really right as the pandemic took hold. Since that point in time, we have had the opportunity to work with the sponsors to talk with them about our key priorities. Jamie is going to talk a lot about the work that the regulatory experts have done to ensure that member companies are aligned about what are our priorities. And this group of regulatory experts have actually met diligently over the course of the last year plus since that initial introduction, so that we could effectively communicate to the sponsors what are our priorities, what kinds of policy changes would we like to see in the underlying legislation to achieve those priorities, and really why do they matter. So the sponsors remain the same. So in the House, we have Representatives Diana DeGette from Colorado, a Democrat, Republican Larry Bucshon, who is a physician. They're both on the House Energy and Commerce Committee that's got jurisdiction over FDA issues, so really key committee positions for those sponsors. And in the Senate, we have Senator Michael Bennet from Colorado, a Democrat, and Senator Richard Burr from North Carolina. He's a Republican. And importantly, Mr. Burr is the ranking member on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. That's the committee that has jurisdiction over the FDA. That's the committee that will be working on VALID. This is a very important issue for Mr. Burr personally. And as we think about the long-term trajectory of this legislative effort, the most likely legislative vehicle to which VALID would be attached will be the next user fee reauthorization package for medical devices. So Senator Burr is going to be terrifically instrumental in those MDUFA negotiations. This is, after all, a 50-50 Senate. And again, he's got that very strong personal interest in VALID, and he will be a strong ally in the effort to move VALID forward. Importantly, as well, we do fully anticipate the Biden administration to be supportive of diagnostics regulatory reform. We do appreciate that just prior to the reintroduction, HHS FDA did provide some technical assistance to the VALID sponsors. We'll talk more about that later. Now, when we think about the bill as a whole, we certainly provided very significant feedback to the sponsors, again, over the course of the last year plus. What we see in this new reintroduced version is policies that largely remain the same from what they were in 2020. So you're not going to see a tremendous amount of change for those of you that are very familiar with VALID 2020. Still the same framework, still largely the same character of the package. There are a couple of important exceptions, and there are things that we advocated for that are really significant. Nate and Jamie will get into those. One that I'll highlight in particular is some pretty significant changes to really, in effect, broaden the scope of the types of tests that can come into the technology certification pathway. So that's the pathway that really is geared toward embracing innovation. We'll, again, talk about that as the presentation progresses. So I'll just round out this slide by saying, we do expect a legislative process that is going to allow for us to continue to have the opportunity to weigh in on the substance of the package. We'll do that in both the House and the Senate. We'll do that with the bill sponsors and increasingly with the committees that we aim to support taking up this work in earnest in the days and weeks ahead. So there will be continued, again, opportunity to improve the package, and certainly we'll be re-engaging with the FDA. Many of you know we had a number of so-called listening sessions with CDRH in the past on VALID. We look forward to continuing those sessions. We found them incredibly helpful and often productive as well. So I am actually going to turn the presentation over now to our colleague, Nate Brown. And Nate, did I bypass a slide there, or no, we're good. Okay. So Nate's going to begin really walking us through the substance, starting with a description of some of these really key definitions. It's really important to grasp the definitions as we contemplate how the framework would be put into practice. So Nate, thanks so much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Susan. And, as Susan alluded to, a lot of the bill that's been introduced here is the same as what they introduced in 2020. So for some of you who have really good memories, when we did a version of this at March of 2020, at the beginning of the public health emergency, you'll say, oh, some of this is familiar. I'll try to call out the differences, the significant differences as we go through, because that will help sort of set the stage for the initial assessment that AdvaMedDx is doing on the reintroduced bill. But as Susan alluded to, it's important to start with some of the key concepts and definitions, not to go through them line by line, but just to provide that baseline foundation of what some of the key concepts are in Valid that are sometimes different than what are used in the device context now. So one, just starting with in vitro clinical test. It's a broad definition. It explicitly includes lab-developed tests, so it sort of does away with that ambiguous status of LDTs. It also includes traditional IVDs. It includes things ranging from specimen collection and transport articles to components. And it also includes diagnostic-related software. So software that is either explicitly diagnostic or that provides information for diagnosing would then come in under this framework. So a lot of the conversation around the regulation of clinical decision support software that falls on the device side of the line, that would then fall under this framework. And the cures exemptions for certain software continue to apply. So if it's something that falls under an exemption for software, it would still be exempt. But for device software that is diagnostic or provides diagnostic related information, it would then sort of fall into this framework and no longer under the device framework. Also, the other two really big building blocks that we show on this slide are analytical validity and clinical validity. Analytical validity basically meaning the ability of the IVCT to identify, measure, calculate, basically to perform the function that it is designed to perform. And then clinical validity, which is really going to its clinical purpose of achieving its intended use. Those two concepts would replace under Valid the more familiar, for those currently familiar, safety and effectiveness. So right now for any device, including an IVD, it's safety and effectiveness. Under Valid, it is analytical validity and clinical validity. We can go to the next slide. Can we, am I controlling or is...
Nate, I think you should see the high risk and low risk definitions on your screen.
Oh, okay. I may be having a weather-related freeze, so I'm still on slide 5. But if everybody else can see slide 6 with the high risk and low risk definitions. So bear with me for 1 second. I'm just going to pull up on my other screen just to make sure if this continues to happen that I can see what you all see on my local version. Oh,
and I just want to make sure if anybody can give us a thumbs up that they can see slide number 6. That would be helpful.
Susan, I've got slide number 6.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good.
All right. Thanks. Thank you.
So high risk and low risk are two of the terms that the AdvaMedDx working group spent a lot of time thinking about, continue to think about a lot. And so, high risk is basically an IVCT, which when used as intended, it's an important caveat, an undetected inaccurate result would present unreasonable risk for serious or irreversible harm or death to patients or serious harm to public health, or is potentially likely to result in the absence, significant delay or discontinuation of life-supporting or life-sustaining treatment. Those risks should take into account, multiple factors and the use of the context of use of the test. Low risk is an IVCT that, when used as intended, for an undetected inaccurate result would cause minimal, no or immediately reversible harm or disability, or only a remote risk of adverse patient or public health impact. And again, that determination is supposed to take into account the context of use of the test and how well understood it is and the like. So that's high risk and low risk. We could spend sort of the hour diving deeply into those, but we won't. But the key sort of thing you might notice here is that there's high risk and low risk. There is no official category in the bill for moderate risk, but there very much is space in between these two categories. And For whatever reason, the bill language doesn't include that, but it still remains very much the case that a test that is not high risk and is not low risk would fall into this middle category, which has implications that we'll get into. So I may every now and then slip into referring to it as moderate risk, because that's functionally what it is. And under the current scheme, if you're familiar with the current scheme, I mean, we're really talking about moderate risk class 2 tests in that middle category. But just be aware, at the moment, if you did a find function through valid, you would not find a reference to moderate risk. So there is that middle category. It's just not defined. And these two definitions then become very important, because from a test categorization perspective, they sort of define how the test would be regulated. And they therefore are important also because we all sort of want predictability in terms of understanding, how a test that comes in under valid would be treated vis-a-vis how the test would be treated today. It's also important to recognize for both high risk and low risk that a test can have, and in many or most cases will have, mitigating measures. Once applied, a mitigating measure might mean that a test that in the abstract is high risk, once you apply this type of mitigating measure, it would no longer be high risk and would sort of be moderate risk. Similarly, you might have a test that's kind of in that middle ground now, but with mitigating measures applied, it could then be low risk. So if we jump to slide 7, we're going to see what a little bit more about the mitigating measures. And again, I have a little bit of a delay, but I don't know.
We're on 7, Nate.
You're on 7? Okay. So these mitigating measures function sort of equivalent to how in the current device system a special control works. So a device can have special controls. Often a special control helps a device that might be considered a class 3 PMA level device, but with special controls, it can be class 2. Mitigating measures are basically going to work the same way in valid. So it's a control, a standard, a requirement determined by FDA to be necessary for an IVCT to meet that applicable standard. Again, that standard of generally analytical validity and clinical validity. It can be labeling, it could be conformity to a performance standard, it could be certain testing, or any number of things. And AdvaMedDx, some of our comments went to making sure that mitigating measures were fully comprehensive and could cover any number of things. It's important to note, getting slightly into inside baseball here a little bit, that mitigating measures primarily function to help shift risk category of the test. FDA also, we understand from informal conversations, understands the term simply to mean good conditions to apply to a test. And so in some cases, what they're thinking of as a condition, it might not be one that shifts the category, but it would still be something that should apply. And so that's sort of a situation which the bill language is potentially being understood slightly differently, and something that we'll need to work through. Applicable standard, I mentioned it in passing in mitigating measure. Again, that is the standard, essentially standard of approval. So it's not reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, it's reasonable assurance of analytical and clinical validity. There are a couple of special carve-outs there. For instruments, it is only analytical validity, which makes sense. And then for articles used for taking or deriving specimens, it's analytical validity as well as safety. So a couple of other key concepts here. First of a kind. So this is a test that's basically new. It's an IVCT that has a different intended use and different indications for use than any other legally marketed test. This is another place where FDA has a very different concept for how they want to think about first of a kind that has to do with notification elements. That was in an earlier version of the bill. It's not in this version, which I think we prefer. This is a more understandable standard for this. So, basically first of a kind, particularly when you're not talking about, the really high risk category of tests, first of a kind is really what we would think of today like de novo. So, there isn't an existing classification, and it needs to be designated and categorized in some way. And then that becomes important because from a risk perspective, depending how it gets categorized, that affects how it's going to be reviewed or if it's going to be reviewed down the road. So this is the standard that's used. And then the question is, how do you sort of figure out with FDA, is it first of a kind or not? Last one on this slide, technology. So this is another new concept. It's not really a concept in the current device. I mean, the word is used, obviously, but it's not used as a sort of statutory term in the medical device world. So it's defined as a grouping of IVCTs that do not significantly differ in control mechanisms, energy sources, or operating principles, and for which design, development, and manufacturing would be addressed similarly. And in the definition, they provide examples of technologies such as immunoassays, mass spec, and next-gen sequencing. And this will become important because the technology is really the currency for defining what's known as the technology certification, which we will be talking quite a bit about. Let's jump to slide 8. Okay, so overall framework of valid. There's a wide variety of IVCTs that are subject to registration and listing, plus an additional comprehensive test information system database. Then the next level down is, there are many types of tests that are exempt from pre-market review. And those, as is always the case, those exemptions themselves are subject to certain limitations, which are important. And then there are review pathways. There are sort of full review. There's kind of what they refer to as a special pre-market review, but you can kind of think of it as a more abbreviated form of review for what I'm not supposed to call moderate risk tests. And then there's the technology certification. And then there's, just as is today, a breakthrough designation that applies for tests for all categories. And then what isn't in the statute today for devices, although FDA does use it informally, is change protocols. And so we're going to talk through all of that. We're going to talk through some of the post-market elements and then also through the transition process, how we get from the current scheme to valid if and when this is enacted. So let's jump to slide 9. This is basically showing the same thing that I just mentioned. We want to kind of go through this at a high level and show, kind of fill in each of these buckets. But we thought this kind of visual helps sort of provide a way to think through the issues. So let's just go straight to slide 10. Great, thank you. So again, as I mentioned, there is, similar to now, there is the same registration and listing concept that applies to most IVCTs. This version of registration and listing is slightly more, either more transparent or more creates more obligations, depending which way you want to look at it. In addition to the standard registration and listing elements that apply now, there are some additional elements like CLIA number for tests that are sponsored by labs. And then in addition to that, there is a much more comprehensive database, the Comprehensive Test Information System, which FDA is to create. And in some ways, this is viewed as an added benefit that helps, I think, to justify what FDA claims will be a broader set of tests that are exempt from pre-market review. So, I think the way that they're thinking of it is you may have more tests that are exempt under valid, but there's this public-facing database that provides transparency about those. So CTIS will incorporate all of the standard registration and listing elements, but it will also include more details like, tie into the regulatory pathway designation. It will include adverse event reporting information. What that looks like exactly, I think, remains to be seen. It'll include information about recalls and other information. And it will be, sort of public facing as well. So it's sort of a regulatory tool, but also a public facing tool that could be used both to understand information about a particular test, but also I think potentially to compare tests of a similar type. Let's jump to slide 11. So as mentioned, there are many test types that are exempt. In some cases, these are tests that are not currently exempt right now, or at least not exempt fully, even if they have their own special pathway. This is largely unchanged from the 2020 bill. It may not be a totally complete list because there's a lot of nooks and crannies in here, but these are kind of the main ones. Grandfathered test is an important one that we will talk about a little bit. This is referring to grandfathered LDTs. Humanitarian tests are an example of one that, currently a humanitarian device is not, it has its own pathway, but it's not fully exempt from pre-market review. Under valid, it would be subject to oversight, but it wouldn't be subject to a pre-market review first. There is a little bit of a weird carve out there for humanitarian tests that are cross-reference tests, meaning they're tests that refer specifically to a particular drug or therapy. And in those, the bill language is sort of curious. It doesn't require them to go through a review, but it requires them to seek, essentially a pre-sub just to sort of have a conversation about it. So that's sort of an odd middle ground. So then with all of these exempt test types, there is also what is known in the exemption section was called a special rule. And it's sort of a clawback function where FDA can determine that a particular exempt test there are concerns about it, and so it potentially should be subject to review. So the standard for FDA to invoke that special rule is that there is either a lack of valid scientific evidence along with a deceptive or fraudulent claim about the product, or that the test is reasonably possible to have serious adverse health consequences. So in those cases, FDA can ask for additional information from the test sponsor, and then take action potentially to subject it to review. And that applies both to the grandfathered LDTs, but also to a wide variety of otherwise exempt tests. And it's different than the other tools that FDA has, like other types of post-market tools that FDA has to address particular adverse events or other situations. So let's go to slide 12. So this is one of the money slides here where we're showing some of the significant changes to valid 2021. This lays out the 3 pathways for pre-market review. There's the full pre-market review, which applies to high-risk tests. You can sort of equate it to a PMA today. It includes raw data. There is this, what they call special pre-market review, which is more abbreviated. It doesn't include raw data. And then there is the new pathway, which is technology certification, which is designed, as mentioned before, to apply broadly to a technology. So it's a voluntary pathway. FDA intends the majority of IVCTs actually that are subject to review to go through tech cert. But the idea is that a representative test would be submitted along with information about the developer's practices and their good practices and methodologies. And then there would be a certification of that technology, and then multiple tests within that technology, within that scope, could then be introduced to market over a period of time, 4 years in the new version of the bill, without having to go back to FDA for a different iteration. So that would include both modifications to a particular test, but it would also include distinct tests within that same technology group. So importantly here, subject to input from AdvaMedDx and I'm sure others, one of the key concerns or limitations was that the technology certification pathway, which doesn't apply to high risk, so we're talking about that kind of middle ground where the bulk of reviewed tests would be, they also had various sort of categorical exclusions. So a test that was a cross-reference test or a direct-to-consumer test or a home use test or a first-of-a-kind test was not going to be eligible for tech cert, even if it wasn't high risk. And so that was a major sort of pushback. And so in this version of the bill, they actually got rid of those categorical exclusions. So it's still the case that if a test is high risk, it's not eligible for tech cert, but you don't have sort of an arbitrary kind of preclusion of, a DTC test or some of these other categories of tests that are, they're the big movers in the industry, right? They're innovative, they're growing rapidly. And so they're no longer sort of categorically excluded from tech cert, which is helpful. The other reason that this is important is because that middle pathway, that abbreviated review, the way it's defined in the bill, it's defined as being open to any test that is tech cert eligible. So that change then ends up doing double duty, because in the 2020 version, while there were I think it's fair to say it was a little unclear. The drafting wasn't super precise and it was open to some interpretation. But I think the general view is that some of these test types were also sort of not eligible for this abbreviated review pathway. So by changing them in tech cert and making them eligible, it also means that they'd be eligible for special review. Again, assuming that from a risk perspective, they belong there. If they're high risk, they're high risk. But if they're not high risk, they could then go through this more abbreviated review. So that's sort of the big, again, that's kind of like the big, there are other changes too, but that's kind of the most impactful one from my view in the 2021 version. The breakthrough designation, as I mentioned, applies across the board. So just as now under the device breakthrough, at an earlier stage before you're ready to submit your application, you can seek breakthrough designation. That's still the case under VALID, and you could use it both for the traditional review pathways, but also for tech cert. And then also within the traditional review pathways, full and special, the bill includes the concept of a change protocol. So within your application, you would include a proposal to allow for certain changes to be made that would otherwise be subject to a new review, right? So we're talking about a modification that would normally trip, having to do a supplemental application, but you could define a scope of change that could then be covered by a change protocol, and you would not have to go back to FDA for a new review. You would report it, but you would not have to submit a new application. So let's jump to 13. This is a sort of a visual or attempt to do a flow chart that kind of captures some of what was already on the last few slides. If any of you do remember the March 2020 presentation, we had a similar version, but one of the effects of those changes that were made that we just discussed is it does actually simplify this flow chart. It doesn't necessarily make it like less cluttered, but from a brain capacity standpoint, it makes it more simple and also predictable and easier to follow, which is important. So again, if you're thinking about how to categorize your tests, if you want to start running some of your tests through what valid would look like, you start by saying, is it in one of these exempt categories? If it's not, then again, there's this special carve out for instruments or specimen receptacles. If it's one of those, it goes to special pathway only. Those are not eligible for tech cert. There is one special sort of situation for instruments that was a beneficial change made in 2020, where if it's part of an instrument family, it doesn't need a separate review. But in general, instruments or specimen receptacles go into that special pathway. If it's not one of those, then you ask, is it tech cert eligible, which at this point is equivalent virtually in every case to saying, is this high risk or not? If it's tech cert eligible, you then have the choice of either using that special pathway or going for a technology certification. And if it's not, then you're in the high risk bucket, subject to that full application. There's this other box over here for redesignation. So we sort of showed that, if you have something that's subject to full application, there is a mechanism in the bill, which is, in my view, less cumbersome than the current reclassification process, where you can make the case, again, maybe it's sort of offering new mitigating measures, whatever the case may be, you can make the case that it should be redesignated not as high risk and eligible for tech cert. You can also use redesignation to move, all the way to exempt as well. So let's jump to the next slide. So this gets into the actual review timelines for the different types of review. I alluded to it in passing, but it's also just worth flagging that just as with the current system, the bill does contemplate a pre-submission process. They call it request for informal feedback. They sort of assign a 60-day kind of expectation for those meetings, and then a process for kind of resolving and documenting the feedback received. But then when it comes to the actual review types, VALID borrows a little bit from the drug review process. So instead of having sort of the way the timelines work now for 510K and PMA, where you submit, there is this refuse to accept, refuse to file window, but that clock, that, the 510K review clock or the PMA review clock, right, those are running. So the way that VALID works is more like the drug context, where you first have a submission, and then FDA has a period of time to review and decide whether it's sort of ready for filing or refuse to file. And then there's once it's accepted for filing, then there's there's a separate amount of time to make the full decision. So in the case of the full review, and again, the wording here is a little clunky, so this is our best interpretation, but there's a degree of there's like not quite the same degree of confidence, right? But the way it seems to be written is you'd have a sort of a 60-day review for acceptance, and then a 90-day review on the substance, and then together it ends up being 150 days, which is kind of equivalent to PMA. And then the special review works the same way, but it would be 120 days. And the tech cert works a little bit differently. It's 90 days, within 90 days issuing a statement of deficiencies. It then also says within 90 days issue a decision. So there's something odd there in the drafting, and we're not sure quite what the intent is. We referenced this earlier, but the tech cert, the grant of tech cert is 4 years. So the previous bill, it was sort of like up to FDA, like up to 4 years, but now it's statutory 4 years, which is good. And then it would be renewed. So the idea is, at the end of your 4 years, you renew. If you don't renew, and this is an important caveat that was added as well, if you don't renew your tech cert order, it remains the case that any tests that were introduced to the market under your existing tech cert order remain, legally marketed. So when your tech cert order ends, it doesn't mean everything under it ends. It just means you can't continue introducing new versions or new tests any longer. Okay, we can probably jump to the next slide. So that was sort of a whirlwind through the pre-market framework. Then there are various other important policies and requirements that don't lend themselves quite as neatly to boxes on a slide, but they're important to go through, and a lot of those are also on the pre-market side. And some of them, I'm going to go through the highlights. Many of them largely mirror the current device statutory framework, but in other cases they are different. And it's important to have some sense of kind of both categories. So let's jump to slide 16. So, the one thing, well, not the one thing, but one thing that the current Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act does not currently do is address the overlap with CLIA, or explicitly address the FDCA's authority over lab developed tests. So the VALID does that. So VALID addresses CLIA and LDT specifically in numerous instances, and it has specific provisions on a number of these topics. And this is a key decision for the bill sponsors, because there were many that wanted part of this exercise to be to open up CLIA as well. So that's not the road they took. So the approach they took is to leave CLIA alone, but then try to avoid duplication. And then in some cases acknowledge CLIA's oversight of labs. And in some cases, those could be considered accommodations. In other cases, they may be considered limitations or clarifications. So a couple of them to highlight. Specific provision for labs and other blood and tissue establishments provides that the framework will not change or modify CLIA. So right up front, or the Public Health Service Act in the case of blood and tissue facilities. So right up front, there's sort of a statement of principle that it's not, it's sort of running parallel with those other statutes. It's not overriding them in other ways. It also provides a sort of a clear statement that it's not, that valid should be understood to avoid duplicating those requirements. Some of the other specific overlaps with CLIA and with lab tests are there are conditions for emergency use, which would allow CLIA labs in the event of a public health emergency to start offering a test pending submission of an EUA if certain other conditions are met. So this is actually clearly picking up on at least one version, depending on your sequencing and time, one version of FDA's policy towards lab developed tests. So that's included in valid as well. Registration and listing also, makes a reference to CLIA. And then grandfathering we talked about, and it'll come back again in a little bit, but qualifying lab developed tests would be eligible for grandfathered status subject to that FDA clawback or special rule authority. So a grandfathered test is a test that would be offered for the first time before the enactment of valid, but it can't be modified in a way that would trip what would normally require a submission under valid. So to the extent that it is modified, it would then not have its grandfathered status anymore. It would be subject to review. And go to the next slide. So there's some other CLIA specific provisions just to mention. In place of the kind of quality system as it's referred to in the device framework, valid refers to it as test design and quality requirements. And in the case of labs, so the section on quality requirements spells out that lab operations will be continue to be under CLIA and CMS, and it also provides different requirements for different types of categories of labs, high complexity on down, and then it directs FDA to consider whether the developer participates in an audit program, and kind of includes some of that least burdensome language in terms of FDA coming up with a scheme. We can jump to slide 18. Okay, so that was sort of kind of a little bit of a dive into the CLIA overlap, but then there are other provisions that are just important to just flag, have a concept around. Again, all of them are ones that could lend themselves to a fairly long discussion, but in the effort just to provide a good kind of foundation and overview, we'll kind of go through them fairly quickly. So again, just talked about quality requirements for labs. That is within a section that applies quality requirements to all IVCTs. I mentioned that it lays out right in there that specific requirements that would apply to labs, or basically specific accommodations. There actually is very little that it says in the current version about quality requirements as it applies to non-labs. So there is a reference to FDA issuing rulemaking. And so a lot of that as of now would be fleshed out in the context of rulemaking. Recognized standards. This is also, this is an example of, basically a provision that isn't that far from current law for devices. FDA can establish performance standards There's a process for them to do that. Labeling, Valid does have its own labeling section. It also is roughly similar to the labeling requirements for devices, at least as laid out in the statute, right? A lot of that is sub-statutory, but what's in there for Valid, they do include some exemptions and alternative requirements for certain test types. Labeling information is to be made publicly available, and FDA does have, this is another area where FDA has to issue guidance. There were some specific provisions that AdvaMedDx highlighted to call out in the labeling section. Not all of those have been added, so that's another topic for kind of continued discussion. Like one example is there's a provision in there for state in one place option for labeling, website labeling, but it only applies to labs, so that's an example of where it makes sense to apply across the board. There were also some call-outs that were recommended and still need to be adopted, having to do with use of symbols and adding certain other reimbursement-related coding to labeling. Let's jump to slide 19. So Valid's treatment of adverse events is a little bit different than the current FDCA. It sort of combines what are currently two concepts under MDR reporting. You've got adverse events and malfunctions, and they sort of combine those two concepts into the definition of adverse events. So you get sort of both of them kind of in one. There's sort of 5-day reporting and quarterly reporting instead of the current regime of 5-day and 30 days. There's a slight difference in the standard. They use a reasonable likelihood to cause serious injury for malfunctions rather than would be likely. So there are some differences there. It's also worth noting that a number of tests that are exempt from pre-market review are still subject to adverse event reporting. I think that includes, as of now, that includes grandfather tests, custom tests, humanitarian tests. All of those would still be subject to adverse event reporting, even though they're not subject to pre-market review. Some of the others are not. Let's jump to slide 20. And I apologize for my little delay. I have a little bit of a delay where I get the slide about a minute after it shows up. So I'm glancing over here because I've got my separate copy. So adulteration and misbranding, it's largely the same as so in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act now, there's an adulteration section, there's a misbranding section. They both apply across the board to FDA-regulated products. Valid, took the approach of developing its own section specific to IVCTs for both of those. They're largely the same. There are a few specific criteria and certain Valid terminology that is used in those sections. But they're largely the same. In terms of remedies, and by remedies, we're just referring to the different tools that FDA has on the post-market side. These are also fairly similar to the current tools that FDA has. There's similar recall process. There's similar post-market surveillance authority and ability to order other post-market remedies like repair, replace, refund. So a lot of that is, again, very, very familiar to anybody whose IVDs have been regulated as medical devices. Let's jump to 21. So collaborative communities, this is new. So this is not something that's currently in the statute. As many of you know, FDA certainly is making use of collaborative communities sort of informally, but they clearly wanted the statutory authority to do so now. And I think their main reason for wanting this authority is because under the FACA rules, there are limitations to how FDA can participate in different groups, and they want this authority in the statute to participate in these communities outside of the context of FACA, outside of those limitations. I think there are some concerns about how these will operate in practice. There are some protections that are built into the statute. I think they've evolved over time. They're not changes from 2020 to 2021, but there have been some improvements in my view, making sure that these are appropriately transparent and representative. But I think it's another area that's going to keep getting attention. You can go to the next slide. Okay, a little bit of a hodgepodge here, but some of these things, you'll say, what about X, right? So accredited persons for review, so third-party review and third-party inspection. There is authority for both of those invalid, similar to the current device framework. There are appeal provisions. Significant decisions do require substantive summary of rationale, as is the case for most device-related provisions, not all, but most. There is a preemption provision. This is, I think it's interesting because the current preemption provision for devices is generally interpreted to apply to PMAs, but generally doesn't offer protection to 510K cleared devices. This preemption provision basically applies to approved IVCTs, and the wording, matters. And so under valid, both traditional pathways are considered approved, and any test introduced legitimately under a tech cert order is also deemed approved. So I think the argument would be that all three categories of tests are approved, and so potentially the preemption provision is more comprehensive than the existing provision. Resources. Let's talk about resources. As many of you all know, the MDUFA process is ongoing. The valid bill sort of is written at a point in time, and it sort of contemplates a negotiation happening that would already need to have happened or have started already, the way that it's written. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to the timing, but what's important is that the way that it's written is it would be a separate negotiation, separate from MDUFA for devices. It would run on the same 5-year cycle, and much of the nature of those negotiations, they've basically just lifted the MDUFA language over. So the same kind of concept of negotiating with the regulated industry and having stakeholder meetings at the same time, having to make reports to Congress. One interesting add-on, though, to the user fee provision here is that it indicates that user fees would not be available unless and until FDA issued certain policies that are required and valid relating to the way the pre-market review processes work. So I say policies on purpose because it's written, it refers to guidances. As we'll talk about in a minute, the pre-market review pathway implementation was changed in valid 2021 from guidances to rules. So there's a little bit of a disconnect because it's referring to guidances when it's really going to be rules. But I think it's an interesting, a little bit of congressional commentary here on the side. I mean, that's clearly like kind of a Senator Burr type of thing to do, to want some accountability and timing. And so I think it'll have to be adjusted to make it work. But I think the idea that they were trying to get across is some type of tool to make sure that some of these deadlines that we're going to talk about in a second for implementation don't wander, right? Don't sort of end up getting delayed. So that's kind of interesting. We'll have to see how it plays out in practice because, again, you may not really have many user fee negotiations going on until some of this has already happened, but it's kind of an interesting add-on.
And now I'm just going to do one little bit of housekeeping here right now. So I can see that it is 4:26 right now. We have until 5 o'clock. So I want to make sure we leave at least 20 minutes for Q&A. So just want to make our speakers aware as we head into this section on transition process. And then next we'll talk about our preliminary assessment of the package. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks for the call out on the clock. Yeah, so let's speed it up a little bit so we can get to Jamie. Transition process, it's changed somewhat from valid 2020, but the notion is, right, you've got to find some way to get from where we are an enacted law, effective date, on to, how do you get that transition to happen? So if you have a device that's been cleared or approved already, it will be deemed approved under valid, right? So it's like you don't do anything new, you just, it becomes an approval under valid. If you have an exempt device, IVD device, it will be deemed exempt under valid with an exception for instruments, and FDA does have the ability to sort of change its mind as it does now, but at least as a starting point, if you're exempt now, you would start off as exempt under valid. If you have a review ongoing on the valid effective date, whether it's almost done or whether you, as far as I can tell, if you submitted it the day before, those reviews will be completed based on the framework under which they were submitted. So if you submit a 510K, valid takes effect, they'll still review it and clear it as a 510K, and then it would presumably be, deemed approved. Breakthrough is one that I think it's just an accident, but they didn't specifically say that if you have a breakthrough designation, it ports over and remains, so designated under valid. Let's jump to the next slide. Okay, as might have been mentioned, valid takes effect 4 years after enactment. It's a little different than the terminology in valid 2020, which sort of tied to like January 1st of 4 years after. So it's a little shorter, but it's still 4 years. We talked about LDTs would be grandfathered. And then there's transitional tests. So transitional tests, this is another area where the wording is a little hard to follow, but I think the concept is intended to be that if there is an LDT that is introduced after valid is enacted, but before the effective date, it can stay on the market during that period and for a little bit of period after valid, as long as they submit an application. So grandfathered never has to submit an application, but they can't change them. Transitional LDTs would have to submit an application eventually. The wording is a little odd about the timing, so let's just sort of leave that as a conceptual issue because it's kind of complicated to go into the two ways to interpret it. And then let's jump to 25. This is sort of a visual that shows the different things that FDA has to do during this transition period, different guidances, different public meeting thrown in there, some regs. More things are regs than before, so that's helpful. And some of the timelines have been, I believe, like pushed up, at least from the beginning. So this, I mean, if you just think of it from a practical perspective as a company trying to adjust, you've got to have these, you've got to know what the pathway looks like, well in advance. So if they could hit that 2-year mark, you still have 2 years to plan your application. If it starts getting to be where they're finalizing a reg or even a guidance in year 4, it's pretty darn hard, right, to not lose some time in terms of submission. So those are helpful changes, but there's some fine print there that needs to be worked through. So with that, I'll turn it to Jamie.
Thank you, Nate. And I'll try and be cognizant of time because, as Susan said, we do want to make sure that there's adequate time for some good Q&A. So turning to the assessment tool, Susan mentioned earlier that the regulatory experts have been instrumental in the past in determining and helping us assess the legislation in the past and are starting to do so again. So we have this framework that we used essentially to try and help guide that process, identifying key priorities and then criteria in which we could assess against those particular priorities. Top-based priorities, and those remain, are risk-based nature of the framework and having a fully risk-based framework, allowing for streamlined post-market modifications, and tech cert, right? This new innovative tech cert or a pathway that fosters innovation. And we are already starting to use it again. Next slide, please, Samita. Thank you. Mentioned these are the top 4 priorities. Next slide. Risk-based framework, right? Nate talked a lot about how this system is intended to be risk-based, that it's the level of review or any review is commensurate with the risk, which we believe is key, but it needs to be throughout the bill in all ways. There were very favorable, well, the very is mine, but favorable revisions to tech cert right, which removed those automatic exclusions, those categorical exclusions that did not have anything to do with risk and resulted in absurd results in certain instances. That has been removed. And Nate also described how this has sort of the 2-for-1 benefit of also opening up the special pathway. So those are both good. And it's sort of, risk-based is throughout, and it's one of those things where you have to examine in multiple areas. So we've made advances. There's going to be further, and we've already started that assessment to continue, particularly of some of these key definitions that Nate mentioned at the beginning: high risk, low risk, mitigating measures, and also some of the appropriate application requirements. Next slide, please. Modifications is probably the area of the legislation that remains the most the same. And here, basically, the bottom line is we want to make sure that the only time you're going to need to have supplemental FDA review is if there are clinically meaningful changes. That's not how the bill is. That's something that we'll be continuing to work on. Now, it is notable that there are change control protocols, right? That's something that we discussed, and we do like that. They are favorable, even though they're already used. It's helpful to have them enacted, and they are subject to annual reporting. And so we would also like to see the annual reporting scaled back. And there's also a particular issue with some of the manufacturing site changes and how those would be treated. Next slide, please. Technology certification, we've talked a lot about this. I would just reiterate the removal of those categorical exclusions. Next slide. Transition, Nate talked about this. This is one where we think there were some drafting errors. We think they were trying to move various documents to regulation and establish timeframes, but they did so in such a way that it's quite unclear, and so we will be doing additional analysis. And the other thing that's really important here is to ensure that there's no potentially perverse incentive to try and get on the market with a less than quality IVCT to avail oneself of the potential grandfathering. So that's something as well to be working on. Next slide, please. As Nate mentioned, there are these additional areas of the bill. Although the ones I mentioned previously are the highest priority, there are sort of a secondary priority. And I will just mention that suddenly these moved, and I that include the ones you see here, many of which Nate discussed. I want to particularly draw attention to point of care CLIA waiver, which is an area we had substantial revisions to, and I think is very important to many of our members as an area of public health importance. So this is something where we'll be continuing to work. Next slide, please. And to Susan, that concludes my portion.
Great, Jamie. So would you say, in essence, then, as we sort of think about at least that preliminary assessment you're undertaking with our member company regulatory experts, that we certainly see some benefits to our advocacy over the course of the last year, particularly with regard to the risk-based nature of the framework and the usability of TechCert and the special pathway. But work to be done through that legislative process, and as you align and assess and align around that assessment, actually, we'll be able to help guide our government affairs colleagues with those remaining priorities, additional policy changes, clarifications, etc. So safe to say, so good forward momentum, and yet work to be done on some of those key priorities.
Very well said. Thank you, Susan.
Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about next steps at a high level. And I should mention too, we did have a call a couple of days ago. Every other Tuesday afternoon, Sarah Keeleen, who runs our advocacy effort on the Hill, and she is AdvaMed's Vice President for Government Affairs. She runs these calls, diagnostics, regulatory reform, stake strategy calls, again every other Tuesday. And if you haven't joined those calls, please do, because it's a nice mix of regulatory experts and government affairs experts And this past week, we talked about VALID. We started talking a little bit about legislative process moving forward. And we had a number of new company representatives join that call. And it occurred to us that we might want to have a sidebar session for folks that are kind of new to the legislative process, very much experts in regulatory issues and quality systems issues, but less familiar with legislative process. So this is an inserted advertisement. If any of you are interested in a legislative process 101, we're going to do that tomorrow at noon Eastern time. Just send me a message or send Sarah a message if you'd like to participate. A quick 20-minute overview of how a bill becomes a law, how we think about some of the key concepts like co-sponsorship, etc. So again, just a little inserted advertisement for that legislative 101 session tomorrow. So right now I'm just going to talk a little bit about, at a high level, what we anticipate seeking to do on the Hill and with stakeholders over the next several months, right? So as Jamie said, we have a group of regulatory experts. We call this group our VALID sub-team. We have at least a dozen, maybe 15, maybe more companies represented on that sub-team, some of whom have been meeting virtually weekly since VALID was introduced in 2020. So, thanks for their work. If you're a regulatory expert, you want to roll up your sleeves and join us, let me know, let Jamie know. You are most welcome. And that is crucial work, that continued assessment of VALID to help guide our advocacy on the Hill and with the administration. So what we are aiming to do next, this month and onward, is in collaboration with the sponsors in the House and the Senate, engage with the committees. So this is the House Energy and Commerce. This is the Senate Help Committee. We want to increase the interest in committee members themselves and the committee staff to take on the work of helping to refine and improve VALID. That's really kind of the next key step that we have, is committee process in both chambers. So we're going to be looking to our government affairs experts for strategies and tactics to do this. One really basic way to do it is to ask committee members, again, in both the House and the Senate, to co-sponsor VALID. Co-sponsorship does not mean endorse. We are not endorsing VALID, to be clear at this point, right? We're glad for the overall framework. There's some policies therein that have tremendous promise, but there's certainly policy changes that we need to see moving forward to ensure that this would benefit your businesses. And benefit patient access and transparency overall. So co-sponsorship, asking for co-sponsorship, again, a mechanism to get committee members to show to their chairpersons that they're interested in this issue. They want the committee to take it up. So we'll be starting to talk with the Hill about that soon, in collaboration and consultation with your government affairs experts. We also anticipate, as I mentioned earlier, requesting that CDRH come together with us again and our regulatory experts to talk about the VALID package, right? To talk about VALID 2021, it's 2021, talk about VALID 2021. Also, the FDA and HHS did offer some technical assistance to the sponsors just before introduction. The substance of that technical assistance, or TA, has not been woven into the bill that we see today. So not woven into what was introduced just a few short days ago. What we would like to do is have a conversation with CDRH, talk a little bit about some of the priorities they're indicating in their technical assistance, and continue to talk with them about the priority policies we think are so important to make sure that this new overarching framework, again, would achieve those aims of embracing innovation, being fully risk-based, being good for patients, for public health. On stakeholder engagement, this is important too. So as many of you know, a couple of years ago, AdvaMedDx approached the American Clinical Laboratory Association and asked to actually co-lead a group of stakeholders. We're pleased that we've been able to do that over the last couple of years. Julie Connie, who is the president of ACLA, and I do from time to time host meetings of a large stakeholder group. So it's members of both of our associations, as well as actually dozens of patient organizations, particularly in the oncology community, that really appreciate the importance of understanding what tests are available, and knowing their performance, right? Particularly for our colleagues in the oncology community, as tests become more and more complex, and as the import of those tests for really determining the very specific trajectory of a patient's treatment, the more important it is that the FDA has oversight of those tests. So they've been very, very good partners. You'll see a note from Julie and I in the days ahead where we ask that stakeholder group to get back together. This is not a group that seeks consensus, right? It's not a consensus setting entity. There will be a little bit of daylight between stakeholders in terms of what we have as policy priority, the specifics of our policy priorities, right? We all agree tech cert is important. We all agree modifications is important. Chain protocols are important, but we might have a little bit of policy differentiation. So rather than seek consensus on the policy in the stakeholder group, what we do is see collective action to encourage the Hill, the administration, to move regulatory reform forward. So look out for an invite from us to pull that stakeholder group together so we can talk a little bit about what those next steps in collective action might be. We'll certainly have a media component moving forward as well. You saw some quick media hits when the bill was introduced. It's important for us to get out the work about, particularly in the advent of COVID, right? The time is very clearly now for greater transparency, knowability of tests and their test performance, certainly. So you'll see us in the media. And then, we'll talk more about strategies and tactics moving forward. But of course, just to keep you all mindful of the fact that our goal here, when it comes to the time frame and the process, is to have committee engagement such that we're improving the package and we move that legislative process along enough that VALID is in good shape by the end of Q2, roughly next year, so end of Q2 2022, so that by the time the Hill negotiators or the Hill leads are looking to understand what riders can they put onto the MDUFA package, diagnostics regulatory reform in the form of an improved VALID is ready to be added onto that package. So that's really sort of the overarching goal and timeline here. So I am going to just highlight one other thing before we open it for Q&A. And again, you'll have these slides. We'll send out a link to the recording. You'll have a PDF of the slides. The links will be live here, but we have resources available to you. And we're going to continue to iterate on those to make sure that you have what you feel like you need to really assess the bill, right? Because that's frankly one of the crucial things for us here. If you walk away with anything today, walk away with the understanding that we are really eager to understand from you all as you start to assess VALID, how would it impact your company? Run your portfolios through the framework, give us that feedback, join the VALID sub-team, join the every other Tuesday calls to continue to help us understand what is important to you as we are going through that constant process of assessment to inform our government affairs strategy on the Hill. So let me do this. I am going to open it up. I'd like to actually ask first if we can have folks that are willing to ask a question verbally. I think this can be, very instructive because it can be iterative, right? We do have some questions in the chat, so we'll get to those if we don't have enough verbal questions. But I see, importantly, our chairman has turned his camera on. So I think you all know Norman Schwartz, CEO of Bio-Rad and current chair of AdvaMedDx. So Norman, happy to have you weigh in with a question or a comment. Please go right ahead.
So thanks, Susan. Just one comment. As we evaluate this, I think it's really important to understand the kind of maybe what I call the bright lines. In other words, there was a discussion about the high risk versus low risk. And, that seems like pretty squishy definitions. And I think as we go forward, we need to make sure that things are much better defined and less subject to interpretation. I just worry if it's too broad that we could suffer consequences in the future.
Yeah, well said. I mean, those definitions are really absolutely crucial. And I thank you for highlighting the high risk and low risk definitions in particular. So Jamie mentioned that a number of regulatory experts had gathered just a day or so ago to talk in particular about that high risk definition. That definition, and we could certainly pull the legislative language and show you, has a number of changes in it that our regulatory experts put forward. So we saw some improvement in that definition. Nate and Jamie, let me just ask you if you want to make any comments on those definitions there. And I'm going to give you sort of a part two, a little bit of an add-on to Norman's questions, thinking a little bit about it, something I saw in the chat, right? We know it takes some getting used to the idea that they'll define high risk and low risk, yet de facto, I think about it this way, de facto, the vast majority of tests that are reviewed, the FDA envisions going through the tech certification pathway, which de facto is really kind of a moderate risk category, right? So Nate, maybe we'll start with you, just a little bit about the clarity of those definitions, and then what you might want to say about how we should think about moderate risk.
Yeah, so I think what the comment is spot on. Obviously, the clarity of the definitions is key, right? Predictability and kind of continuity, except where there's a reason to break from continuity, is important. And I think they've gotten more clear, but there's still work to do. One piece of that, and AdvaMedDx commented on this last time, is we also think it's important to clarify, because this is not starting on a blank slate, right? By and large, there will be new tests that come after valid passes, obviously, but at the moment, you've got hundreds of IVDs already cleared or approved as moderate risk or high risk. And so all of those are going to port over as approved. But one comment that we did make is we should also clarify that if it's porting over as 510K, that should mean it's porting over as moderate risk, right? That it shouldn't be up to open to kind of relitigating what that is. Because that then becomes, some of this is the words on the page. Some of it is the track record and precedent that you have to fall back on. So, we think that would be important, is to make sure there's also that element of something that's PMA today. Okay, we get it. It's going to be high risk. Something that's 510K today, we assume that's moderate risk unless unless FDA has a compelling reason to change. So I guess I would say that. I do. Others on the call are probably closer to the legislative aspects of this, but it wouldn't surprise me also if they end up defining moderate risk explicitly, as opposed to this weird, you still get there by process of elimination, but it wouldn't surprise me if they end up just providing that clarity.
And Nick, can I jump in here for a second? I'm gonna mention something a little bit about what we know of the technical assistance that HHS and FDA has provided. And I need to say first that, it has not been made public, that technical assistance. We were afforded the opportunity to learn what was in that technical assistance, but it is really up to the Hill to share that document. And I am hopeful that they'll share it with stakeholders, with all stakeholders rather readily. But as I understand it, the HHS does contemplate the definition of moderate risk, right? There's not, as we understand it, policy put forward necessarily in that TA as we understand it, but they're contemplating the definition of moderate risk. Is that right, Nate?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, great. Norman, any other comments or questions or advice from you? Oops, I'm sorry, Norman. I think you're muted.
No, sorry. That was it from me.
Okay.
Let's see, we've got some other hands raised.
Yes, we do. Bob from Kaigen. Bob, go right ahead.
Thank you. And hopefully this will be a quick question.
Yeah.
As I was going through the slides as they were presented, it was a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was wondering, does this in effect create a new design control, design review QS for IVCTs that's going to be different than medical devices? So will the QSR essentially be changed for IVCTs?
It's a good question, Bob. There is a separate so, right now, right, QSR under Part 820, right, that would not, as of the effective date, that regulation would not technically apply to the IVCT because it's no longer under the device statutory framework.
Okay.
FDA is going to have to issue a similar guidance, or I'm sorry, a similar regulation. The statutory provision is pretty general. So,
Okay.
I would say one would reasonably assume that they're not going to upset the apple cart on that, but I said one would reasonably assume, right? So there's an assumption built into that.
The reason I ask is if somewhere along the line there'll be an assessment of the financial impact on industry to convert over their systems, right? I mean, if you change a quality system, that could be pretty substantial to a company.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's also one of the reasons why, as a practical matter, I mean, some of this is going to have to be left to implementation, but as a practical matter, that's why it's important to get a lot of these regs and guidances issued with some lead time, right? Because they make mistakes, right? So some chance to say, hey, wait a second, this isn't taking effect for a couple of years still, and we're just letting you know you kind of got this wrong, or you didn't recognize the impact of what you're doing.
And if you don't mind, a second question would be, does it, CBER has transfusion transmitted disease responsibilities, and so they have IVDs that are used for blood screening and plasma. Are they included or excluded by this? Because they follow like drug in the 600 series, not the 800 series.
So I was afraid somebody was going to ask this question.
Sorry, you want me to withdraw it? I will.
Well, I confess we've struggled to understand exactly. We've struggled with that ourselves. I don't think we've gotten a straight answer. And going back even to the 2020 version, and I have not gone back to, I know it hasn't changed, in the 2021 version. So I think that's still a good question to ask that we don't have a totally clear answer for. Yeah. But Jamie, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I would just add exactly that. And we're not alone, right, in wanting clarification on this. This is something where Susan was saying, that there are limited things we can say about that it's up to the Hill to release the TA, but FDA had questions about this as well, as have the members of the sub team. And we don't feel that we have a clear answer yet, and we do want a clear answer. We think it's important. I did also want to say one other thing about 820 is, even without valid, keep in mind we're probably going to be seeing a transition in general on QSR, because FDA has made it very clear that they're planning on transitioning from QSR to 1345. So there's going to be a transition one way or another. So
well, that's good news. That's good news for my company. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Bob. Are there any other colleagues of ours that would like to come on camera, ask a question verbally? Just go ahead and raise your hand. We'd really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you live. And while we see if anyone raises their hand, let me go back into the chat for questions. Okay, so let's see, we have quite a few questions here. And one we touched on moderate risk. I think we got that. We've got another question in here. If this bill were to become law, would it supersede what exists today? Of course, that would indeed be the case. We've got a question specific about NGS, and it's a rather long question. And I think Nate and Jamie, you can probably see that in your chat. One of the things I'm thinking of as I'm looking at this is if there's any comment that we want to make on LDT developers utilizing RUO. But this is really specific here to NGS. And I think the question at the end of the day is, will valid force NGS into a more regulated space where the pathway is not necessarily clear, or do you anticipate that NGS will be specifically addressed in the use of RUOs and the development of such? So I think I know what they're trying to get at. Nate, do you have or actually, let's see, our colleague is, I think it's Ashley. Ashley, can you unmute yourself? You can go right ahead and you.
Yeah, And I apologize, I don't have my camera set up right now. I just got a new computer, and I can kind of summarize, but more, when I was reviewing the VALID Act, there are some specific disclaimers as they relate to ASRs and the further of development in IVCTs, right? But I'm wondering if there's any indication if the use of RUOs, which we know, they're not supposed to be used in a clinical setting, but there is a lack of options, obviously, when it specifically comes to the NGS space and other applications, right? Where sometimes developers are forced to use an RUO and further develop it, even though it may not be meant to be used that way, because that's the only option. And so I'm wondering if there's been any indication if they're going to address this, right? Or will, the way that the VALID Act is written, it would make me think that developers should only be using ASRs in the development of an LDT, right? Because that's the only thing mentioned that would require this disclaimer.
So I have and Jamie, you should jump into, I have a couple of thoughts which are maybe not a direct answer to your question, but I think are relevant to maybe trying to understand what VALID's doing. So one point is that, there is, and we've had discussion, a fair amount of discussion with the sponsors about this, the regulation of components and parts does have, components and parts are regulated, but there is an exemption for RUO, right? And so then the other thing I would just sort of mention is that the treatment of instruments is, there's even if we don't agree with it, the reason given for why FDA has taken a hard line on instruments is because what they're envisioning is that they're going to be doing a lot through TechCert. And what they're saying is our ability to use TechCert effectively and, a lot is they need to have some understanding of the instrument underlying it. So they want to see instruments in some way, shape, or form. It could be including the instrument as part of the review, or otherwise, if it's standalone, they want to see one instrument in the instrument family, right? So, I'm not sure exactly how that will translate. All of those considerations will translate for NGS. When you think of NGS sort of separate from a particular assay. But I think the idea, and NGS is one of the call outs for TechCert, right? So I think in their perfect world, somebody's coming in with an NGS-based test, and then other tests can be run on the sequencer.
And I think that maybe my question stems more from like all of the things that happen before the sequencing, right? There's so many research tools out there, of panels and library prep and all these things that wouldn't necessarily be utilized in a clinical setting, right? But because there are not cleared or approved options, sometimes clinicians or researchers take that technology and develop it further. And there's a lot of questions and gray areas around that. And how do we develop something that can be used in the clinical setting, right? Is that forcing those pieces that happen before the sequencing, right, into this more regulated space that hasn't really existed very much, right?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, probably worth more discussion, because I mean, it's simple enough to say it, but the question is, how does it affect this? Because I think, right, up to that line of research use, right, they're acknowledging that wouldn't be regulated, but then at some point, FDA is seeming to draw a line that they do want to see, they want to see instruments. So yeah, how do you, if you put all the pressure on the back-end developer of the assay, how are they going to get that?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not answering your question, but it's
and that's okay. I know you're not going to have all the answers right now, but it's definitely something that I think is of note that, manufacturers of these types of products and also the end users are going to want to know, like, what's the route, right? In the end.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley, for the question. I mean, I think it's a really good example of the kind of area where further clarity is needed. I mean, that's, Jamie made this point about needed clarity in some of the drafting when she was going through her assessment. I think that could be said about a number of areas. And, that's part of what we anticipate engagement with committees and with the agency will help us do, right? Get much more specific. And again, it's not just for us, but our stakeholder partners and the laboratory community, providers, hospitals, health systems, patient organizations are going to have some of those same questions really as well. So, we look forward to, along with you, learning more with the sponsors and committees, et cetera. But that's an excellent question, and thank you for it. And I'll make one final call here to see if there is a verbal question left. And I don't see any other hands. Maybe we'll just take this one last question. We know we could probably do questions for a long time. We'll do one more. We'll close out today, but we can have additional sessions. And again, we're going to encourage you to join those strategy sessions on Tuesday afternoons. Those I think are a really good opportunity for us to hear from you and to talk about next steps. So last question here. Okay, and we hit on this a little bit, but Nate and Jamie, just for clarity, because I bet other people have this question too. Okay, so from Michelle, question is, a number of instruments and specimen receptacles are currently 510K exempt. True. Will VALID require reclassification of these devices so that every instrument and specimen receptacle will require a special review? Nate, can you just riff a little bit more on what you just said about instruments and that tie into TechCert and then make a comment on specimen receptacle?
Sure.
Please.
Yeah. So, right. So instruments and specimen receptacles are these two areas that are being treated differently. And so what FDA and the sponsors sort of went along with is on instruments, even if it is exempt now, it will not be exempt ultimately under VALID, but there is both a grace period, and again, it's a little hard to define it exactly. It's worded a little weirdly, but you'd have some grace period. It wouldn't be like, the moment VALID takes effect. And then they also kind of conceded ground by saying you just have to have one version of the instrument family come in, and then, they treat the whole instrument family as covered. Specimen receptacles, I don't remember as clearly where it landed, but it's the same dynamic, right? That FDA has this desire to see them. And so it's this kind of exception to the otherwise exempt low risk category.
Yeah, I would just replacement reagent, right? Codifying the replacement reagent category for instruments was very important and helpful, right? That was done, not this version, but the version beforehand. But instruments and specimen receptacles were something that for FDA, they really, really wanted to see. They just, it was something that we had a lot of advocacy on, but it was very important that it was very clear that it was very important to the agency that they see it at least once. So.
Okay, I want to thank everyone today, our speakers, Jamie Wilson, Nate Brown in particular. Thank our chair for joining us today. Norman, really appreciate your being here. And thanks again to all of you. Please do look out for an email from me. You'll get a link to the recording, the slides, other resources. And we look forward to working with you during our continued assessment period with your government affairs colleagues as we map out a strategy to continually improve the package and engage with the Hill, with the administration. This really is our best opportunity to make sure that we are modernizing this regulatory framework to work better for your companies, to work better for patients and for public health. Again, thanks for joining us today and looking forward to continuing work with you. Okay, have a good afternoon. Thank you.